process. The second thing is a lot of people reverse by looking at the binary itself. And especially when you're looking at Windows, looking around the binary can be very helpful as well. For example, there's tools and utilities that often are used to troubleshoot a system or repair a system or service it. And I've seen this a lot from people more on the hardware side or the IoT side or even the car hacking side, where the way they actually got their start is they literally, I don't condone this, but they literally went into a garage and got the manual for like how the CAN bus on this car worked, and they just read the manual that's private to garagists only. The legality of that is somewhere in the gray area, because you could become a garagist yourself and get access to it. Is there an NDA there? I'm not going to discuss legalities, but a lot of people in the hardware world are familiar with this. Well, and the same thing happens in a software world as well, except here they're actually fully legal. These are official Microsoft tools that Microsoft used to release, like the support tools, the resource kit, the SDK tools, the WDK tools. These are tools that analyze Windows behavior, and they'll often call Windows APIs, and they'll often have less stringent security around what they're leaking. There'll be lots of printf statements, perhaps with names of structures and fields of structures from the user side, right? They'll have names of macros. They'll even have source code in some cases. A good example, the best example probably is the Windows debugging tools, which comes with WinBag, which then has the KDX file, the kernel debugger extension files, which know how to print out various kernel data structures, including some that are not in public symbols, because if you look at these DLLs, you literally have printf statements printing out every offset, every field name, every type in a bunch of data structures. And many people, this might be obvious to you, which is great, but many people don't think, hey, let me reverse engineer the plugin for the debugger that knows how to dump the data structure to actually figure out what the data structure looks like. So you have to look outside of the binary sometimes, look around it, reverse other things than just, the kernel itself. Now, other than reversing things, people are often forgetting there's header files for a lot of things, right? In the Microsoft case, there's the SDK, WDK, there used to be the DDK, the IFS, all these kits that provide the officially documented public header files that show you various Windows prototypes. I've seen people at conference talks reverse engineer not MSDN documented, but header documented. They Googled for it. They didn't find a function name. They reversed it what the prototype looked like. If they had looked in the header files, it was right there. There's a lot of stuff that's in the headers that's not on MSDN. Sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. They just don't want to do the tech writing, but it is in the header files. Now, on top of that, sometimes there are header files that they accidentally open up. For example, in Windows 10, Threshold 1 and Threshold 2, WDK had the full set of min-win header files. These are the internal Microsoft headers that one beta build of the WDK had, which included all the system call prototypes and all the exported functions of the kernel and hundreds of data structures and comments, more importantly, around things that had never been seen by anyone. And so a lot of this is paying attention to what's getting released. Download every build, get every symbol, download every header file, build up a collection, because all it takes is one mistake. Right now I've got people emailing me every week, can I please get a copy of the header files? I'm like, they took them offline. I'm not going to give you my copy. I don't know the legality. It's a public thing at some point. After it's deleted, is it still public? I don't know. Get your own copy. It's not that I don't want to share, but clearly they made a mistake and they got rid of this. Or Singularity, which was a research operating system Microsoft worked on, public, which had integration with Hyper-V. So all of the Hyper-V header files are part of Singularity. Still today, you can go on Codeplex and download Singularity.zip, and you'll have some hypervisor header files. For example, Matthew Shrish showed this in one of his presentations. So header leaks or public headers are also a way that I consider is reverse engineering, figuring out the right header file to look and the right build to get. To me, that's part of figuring how something works. And then there's other artifacts